Let's start with the Senate and with the Congress. If you were back there now and you were watching what's happening at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, how do you react? Because a lot of senators were apparently caught off guard by this executive order.
I think the reactions will be divided as the Senate is. Republicans clearly will be reluctant to criticize the new president, recognizing that their futures and interests lie with him and his strength and how he'll be able to proceed. At the same time, as some of them are recognizing, this has the potential to do real harm to American interests in the world. And so those who are primarily focused on international affairs will, I think, be very concerned about this.
Well, you already had John McCain and Lindsey Graham, two of your former colleagues, come out opposed to the executive order over the weekend. To what extent, though, going beyond the immigration issue, does this jeopardize or put tension, at least, on the relationship between the new president and the Congress? Because he needs the Congress to get a lot of the reforms through that he's talking about.
He does, but they need him for the same reason from their perspective on the Republican side. My guess is that there are several other Republican senators who are quietly urging the administration to tamp this down and not going public as Senators Graham and McCain have. So I think the concern is more widespread than you're seeing publicly.
Which raises the question, who can actually apply the pressure? Larry Summers spoke earlier about CEO reaction to Mr. Trump's policy.
I've been gratified by what we've heard out of the tech sector. We've heard rather less so far out of the mainstream business community.
Lloyd Blankfein just now to a letter to employees saying that he does not support the ban. Is the power going to come from CEOs versus Congress?
I think it will be mixed from CEOs, but in my experience, what business in America most is concerned about is uncertainty. Not knowing what's going to happen, and predictability is necessary for reasonable long-term and mid-term planning. And I think those views will be made clear to the White House. Some of them public, as you just mentioned, but I think probably substantially more of them privately conveying a message of concern.
And I should point out, to add on, Lloyd Blankfein also saying in that letter that he sees possible disruption to the firm from the Trump order, so more filtering through.
I think what really interests me, we begin a conversation with you and you say that maybe behind the scenes there's some Republicans quietly pushing back against the president, but I just wonder what the risk of this escalating actually is. There is a risk that he goes beyond this and starts looking at some of the immigration policies that tech companies rely on, so they can get some of those H-1B visas through very quickly for the people they need to hire. What's the risk that this escalates and escalates pretty quickly?
Substantial. Perhaps most remarkable about this order is not the substance of the order, but the apparent lack of any preparation, any internal communication, any reaction from those who are administering the law that is being changed. And I think that's got to be a lesson to President Trump and to those in his administration, because he's got almost 4 years to go, and they need to have more deliberate processes, getting a wider range of views before making dramatic changes.
And going beyond the immigration issue, there's a long agenda here of this incoming president. And I wonder about bandwidth issues. If they get distracted on things like this, will they get to things like, for example, corporate tax reform? Bob Iger, that became CEO when you were chair. You had something to do with that, as I recall. He has been for corporate tax reform for some time. Is there a danger here, from the Congress's point of view, that they'll get too distracted with other things and not get to the core issues on the agenda?
That is a danger, but corporate tax reform ought to be at the top of the national agenda. And interestingly, it's one area where both parties agree on the need. They may not agree yet on the precise response to it, but I think it can happen, provided the administration doesn't do there as they've done with respect to immigration.
Well, markets discounted a lot of that at the back end of last year, so I think a question is time, the when. Is this a 2018 story and not a 2017 story?
Well, the timing really depends upon what the administration and the Congress want. I went through the last major tax reform under President Reagan. I was very deeply involved. I was on the Finance Committee and participated actively in it. It seemed to take a long time because attention didn't focus on it at the outset. But once everybody focused on it, it actually moved fairly quickly toward the end. And I think that can happen here. Corporate tax reform is critical, not just to corporations, as the name suggests, but to the entire American economy. It will go a long way toward dealing with some of the issues that are so troublesome to Americans. Corporations moving abroad, large amounts of money held outside the United States not brought back. It's a comprehensive issue that affects the economy and every American and ought to be near the top of everyone's agenda in Washington.
Does it have the power to offset the more negative aspects, like a potential trade war, like an immigration ban?
One of the sad realities of modern life is that there are so many issues that it's good in some respects. You can move past the mistakes quickly by doing something else. And so the answer is yes, it does have the potential. There are a few areas in which cooperation ought to be self-evident. That's one of them. The issue of a major infrastructure program is another one. Republicans have rejected repeatedly President Obama's request for an infrastructure program, but they're sympathetic to the request from President Trump. Democrats have long wanted it. They ought to be able to move on that quickly. You mentioned tax reform. There are other issues on which there can be cooperation, and I've always felt it's best when you're starting a new administration to begin with things on which you can agree, which tends to mitigate the hostility when you get to those subjects on which you disagree. Unfortunately, the president appears to be doing just the opposite of that.
Exactly. There seems to be a fair amount of disagreement about this executive order at the moment. I want to turn to a different hat that you've worn, which is really international diplomacy, both in the Middle East and Northern Ireland, most notably Northern Ireland. As you look at what's happened over the weekend, what are the challenges that this raises for Rex Tillerson, for example, coming in as Secretary of State?
Of all of these sensational statements that President Trump made in the campaign, the two that disturb me most in terms of international affairs are his denigration of NATO and his extraordinary warming up to Putin. That's a very dangerous thing from the standpoint of the United States. NATO and the European Union were part of a peace project led by the United States after the Second World War to prevent really a Third World War. 100 million people died in conflict in the 20th century. And it's been remarkably successful. And all of a sudden, the United States president's position is to undermine the very things that have been the pillars of stability created by the United States in the Second World War in the name of disruption or change or whatever. That's a very dangerous thing. The second area, to me, is nuclear nonproliferation. The United States led the world into the nuclear age and has led the effort to prevent the weapons from spreading, with remarkable success. There are now dozens of countries which have the capacity to produce nuclear weapons. Only 9 have done so. The rest voluntarily refrain in reliance on the United States leadership and the nonproliferation regime. The most damaging statement I think the president made, or potentially damaging, was when he said, well, it may be okay for South Korea and Saudi Arabia and Japan to get nuclear weapons, then they can defend themselves. We won't have to defend them. If that undermines the nonproliferation regime, we run the risk of a nuclear conflict between nations, or perhaps greater, the leakage of nuclear materials to non-government terrorist groups.
George, I sense from you this isn't the right approach to a number of issues, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not time for a change of approach. I think what some investors are grappling with is what is the true intentions of the president. When he talks about NATO, he also follows it up with not enough countries are spending enough on militaries. If you look at what it's meant to be as a percentage of GDP, only the likes of the United Kingdom, the United States, follow through on some of those pledges. So surely he's right to turn around to a lot of these countries and say, if you want to continue NATO in its current form, then things need to change.
Well, that's been true of every administration for 2 decades.
And they haven't changed.
Well, no, some have changed, some have increased, but not enough. The question is, what's the proper way to get them to do it? I don't think it is saying that if they don't do it, we're not going to honor our treaty obligations. That's like saying 2 wrongs make a right. We should be putting pressure on them, urging them, and I hope this will result in that, but the answer is not for the United States to renounce its obligations under the treaty.